Good evening, everyone. My name is Dan Veru, Co-Chairman and Chief Investment Officer of Palisade Capital Management, and welcome to a very special and timely virtual fireside chat featuring Daniel Clifton, Partner and Head of Washington Policy Research at Strategas Partners. Our topic this evening is infrastructure spending, taxes, and the Biden agenda. There is simply no one more qualified outside of the Biden administration to discuss the Biden agenda than my good friend and fellow Jersey boy, Dan Clifton. For those of you who tune into CNBC, Fox Business Channel, and Bloomberg, Dan is likely a very familiar face as he navigates through complex policy issues. For the past 11 years, he has headed the top-ranked Washington policy team on Wall Street and was recently ranked the #1 group according to Institutional Investor magazine. He is also a top-ranked analyst in tax and accounting policy. Prior to Strategas, Dan was the director of the American Shareholders Association, a nonpartisan organization that analyzed issues facing shareholders. Dan was part of a coalition that successfully lowered capital gains to 15% in 2003. Boy, we could use that now. And helped institute a repatriation tax holiday for corporations, as well as reforms for the private sector pension system. Prior to ASA, he was Federal Affairs Manager for Americans for Tax Reform and was a senior staff member in 2 gubernatorial administrations. Our last fireside chat this past December featured Dr. Kayvon Mojarrad, Director of Emerging Infectious Diseases from the Walter Reed Hospital, and it was expertly moderated by our own Dawn Brock, Senior Vice President for Healthcare Research at Palisade. That event occurred shortly after the launch of 2 groundbreaking and historic vaccines to fight the COVID-19 virus. The launch of these 2 vaccines were perhaps the most potent weapons ever developed to defeat the virus and allow the US and global economies to begin to reopen. Stocks rallied in the US and globally, but I had argued that US small cap stocks would likely be the biggest beneficiary, and I coined the term for the Russell 2000 as the reopening benchmark. And I felt it would rally well into 2021. So far, that has played out with the Russell benchmark leading in 2021 as economic conditions improved and from a potent combination of fiscal and monetary stimulus as well. As Dan stated earlier today on CNBC with Kelly Evans, we've gotten a lot of stimulus or candy, but it might be time for some spinach. As I mentioned, this is an important day for us to speak, and certainly Dan and I did not foresee that we'd be picking the actual day when President Biden would make his first speech to a joint session of Congress to discuss this potential very important legislation. So let's get right into our discussion, and we'll leave time for your questions. So Dan, though you and I love talking politics, it's the policies that are most important as we make active investment decisions. And I'm always worried about policy mistakes and its impact on the economy. There seems to be a bigger philosophical driver going on here for these initiatives. What are the goals and priorities of the Biden agenda? And what do you mean when you say it's time for some spinach?
Yeah, well, good evening. And Dan, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. And I love learning from you. You're one of the best investors I've ever worked with. And I look forward to continuing this discussion because tonight is really just the first step of announcing the agenda. And it really is where Biden is putting out his offer, and then Congress will likely have to deal with it. Let's take a step back and kind of take a look at where we are right now with respect to the Biden agenda. Joe Biden won the presidency by more than 7 million votes nationally. But if you look at what I call the tipping states, these are the states that decide the Electoral College. On a base of 160 million voters, Joe Biden won the election by 65,000 votes. That was the difference between Joe Biden and Donald Trump in Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin, and a Nebraska congressional district. If those 65,000 voters voted differently, Donald Trump would have been sworn in as president of the United States. It's, I think, about 0.04% of the electorate. Very similar to 2016,
right,
where Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton really by 77,000 votes. So you're talking about a football game on a Sunday afternoon, a professional football game difference We truly are a 50-50 country. And when you look at the House and the Senate makeup, it is very rare for a new president to win the election and not have major coattails. The Democrats ended up with a 50-50 Senate, the smallest majority that they've ever had for a new president since 1885. And today, if there's just a 2-vote difference in the House of Representatives between Democrats and Republicans. Now, some of that is due to some House members joining the Biden cabinet. We unfortunately had a member of Congress pass away a couple of weeks ago. But that is as razor thin of a House majority that I've ever seen. And so I believe that we truly are a 50-50 country. Why is this important to the Biden agenda? If you think about where we were on November 4th, we came out of the election. It looked like Biden won the presidency, but the Republicans were going to keep the Senate. We looked at that and we said, divided government. The vaccine is the most important metric in divided government because you're not going to get much stimulus, but you're not going to get a lot of tax increases. 60 days changed the world in politics, though. By January 5th, the Democrats had won 2 seats in the Georgia election and now had control of the Senate. So you can look at that and say, hey, that's a 50-50 Senate. Joe Biden looked at that and said, that is the voters demanding more stimulus and big change. We accidentally have a majority. We need to use that majority to be able to get as many reforms as we can get done. And so the first quarter, we passed a $1.9 trillion stimulus package as a way to bridge to the vaccine. We are now in the midst of a major reopening of the US economy, and we have plowed American consumers with cash to go out and spend that money as we start the reopening. We're probably headed for some of the best economic data of our lifetimes over the next 2 or 3 months. Okay, this is unabashedly good for America. Okay, and so what's happening here is that Joe Biden is starting his presidency with a major tailwind behind him because he's getting what his mandate was. His mandate was get the economy back, get COVID under control. You can argue a lot of that was going to happen regardless of whether Joe Biden was president or not. But because he is sitting in that presidency, he is benefiting from that. We built a model for the election which constantly showed that Trump was going to be closer than what the polls had suggested. As you know, Dan, we kept arguing this race is going to be closer. When we put Biden's numbers in our model today, he is starting off his first 100 days in better shape than any president over the last 50 years. My Republican clients go nuts when I tell them that, but it is just a simple fact and where he's sitting right now. And no matter what party you are, you would love to be starting your presidency with 8% GDP growth and 1 million jobs and COVID on the run here. And so that's where he's starting. And what he's saying is, well, I had so much success on that first COVID package. Let's go really, really big and try to get reforms through that Democrats have been trying to do for the last 50 years and build out an agenda that is focused really looking to the future, not just trying to gap what happened with COVID. 2 parts, infrastructure, physical infrastructure, and the second part, which will be social policy. That infrastructure plan is focused on moving to a clean energy economy through $175 billion for electric vehicles, $110 billion for road and bridges, $110 billion for water so that we never have another Flint, Michigan again.
Right.
$100 billion to upgrade the American grid system, $100 billion for broadband, which I ultimately think will be turned into a 5G kind of building out for the race. Money for artificial intelligence and semiconductors to help compete with China. So that's the first part. That's $2.2 trillion of spending. And I want to make clear that that's over 8 years. It's unlike the COVID where we did 2 trillion immediately. It's over 8 years. What you're going to hear from the president tonight, in addition to that, is talking about these new social policy initiatives. What did COVID show us that Biden thinks the country needs? Paid Family Leave Act, free community college, universal pre-kindergarten for 3 and 4-year-olds, a monthly child tax credit, something I work closely with you, Dan, on, healthcare, a multi-year extension of Obamacare. That comes out to about $1.8 trillion over the next 8 years within the context of that. What Biden is doing here, to answer your question, I'm sorry for the long-winded filibuster here, but to answer your question, Biden is making a bet that the American public want a bigger government to take care of them after the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm not really sure it's going to work, Dan. We tried this in the late 60s and the early 70s, and it failed miserably. And Americans are generally a low tax, less government society. So, as an investor, you've got to respect what Biden's doing. He's got an opportunity. He says, if there was ever a time to do it, now's the time, and I am going to press my bet.
Right. And he's not.
That is now up to Congress to take that. And what's interesting, because I'll answer the second part of your question, is that we cannot just spend this money like we could during a pandemic. This will have to be paid for with a series of tax increases on high net worth individuals and corporations. And when you do that, you're introducing spinach into the equation. It's no longer just candy. And that makes it much harder to pass something like this. It makes it much harder for the economy to grow when you're throwing that spinach out there. And I think Congress is going to give him a lot of review in terms of everything that Biden put out. And that's why I think tonight was an opening bid, and that ultimately it's probably going to get winded down from what Biden's proposing.
And the point you've made numerous times is the higher taxes are instantaneous, but the spending is spread over a very long period of time. And in some case, infrastructure spending, you actually never see it get deployed. It gets eaten up in the bureaucracy, so on and so forth.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so if you think about it, for investors for the last 15 months, it's been all spending and all stimulus to the US consumer. Now you're getting the production that needs to meet that. Now you're getting the reopening. But as we go into 2022, that stimulus begins to roll off. The tax increases are immediate. We're not going to fix the grid in a year. It's going to take us 10 years to fix the grid. We probably need to do that grid. Yep. And so investors have to start bracing that we could be facing a net fiscal drag next year as a lot of this stimulus rolls off and these tax increases come in. But it's going to take a lot to derail the U.S. economy next year. If there's anything that can do it, it's taxes.
That's right.
And I look forward to working with you and just discussing all of these different tax proposals, because this is as aggressive as I've ever seen it in my lifetime, what I read today from the Biden administration.
So Dan, we have a lot of people who are listening to you right now. Everyone on this call is a taxpayer. If the current proposals hold, what happens to the individual rate? It seemed like it's two parts rate. It's part rate, and then of course capital gains. So what's on the table right now?
Yeah, let's start with individual taxes. I would call that the low-hanging fruit in Washington. There is probably not one Democrat in the United States Senate who believes the top income tax rate is too low at 37%. And just about every Democrat wants to raise that to 39.6%. What Biden is proposing is that any income over $400,000 will now be taxed at a higher tax rate. And that's interesting because that's where the 35% rate is. Is there going to be a double bracket? I don't know, but it's a pretty significant income tax increase. We're probably going to see, when we get more specifics from the Biden administration, is possibly a limitation on deductions as well, at least for some old deductions that went in that are technical, they're called the PEEP and the Ps, and they raise some revenue as well. But what Biden is arguing is that wealthy Americans have generated a large amount of savings over the last few years, and if anybody can pay those taxes, it should be at the high income. And so that's where I think the low-hanging fruit is. You asked about capital gains. That's a totally different story about what Biden is proposing now. And what I would argue on capital gains is that the proposal that was put forward today is probably the largest capital gains tax rate that we've seen in history. What Biden is proposing is that once your income hits $1 million, total income, that means ordinary income, income from your business, income from capital gains, income from dividends. Once you hit $1 million, you will then have to pay a capital gains tax rate as ordinary income. So all your capital gains would be taxed at 39.6%. That creates what we call a tax wedge, where your rate would be 20% at $999,000 of income. But as soon as you go over $1 million, that capital gains rate doubles. It creates an effective tax rate that's almost 100%. And a lot of people are going to make $999,000
That's
next
what I
year
was thinking.
if that proposal goes through. You're
Right.
reducing the incentive to work, save, and invest, and you're starting to lower capital gains realizations from that. Look, I think Congress is going to have a really hard time getting to 40%. I count at least 5 senators who expressed reservations about this idea. And we believe that the capital gains and dividend tax rate is going to end up at 28%, up from 20%. One of those reasons why, Dan, is that once you go over 28%, the government starts losing money, tax revenue, because then there's fewer capital gains realizations from that. And that makes a lot of sense to us. We're already seeing a lot of selling happening. You look at the merger, IPOs, the SPACs, all of that are owners of companies selling ahead of this higher capital gains tax rate. That is something that we see all the time before you see this capital gains. Now, maybe it doesn't pass, but what I think people are saying is, hey, the rate's probably not going any lower. There's a good chance it's going higher. Let me take some chips off the table here. Yep. And so automatically, the government's going to get less revenue if this tax increase goes into effect. And so I think it's going to end up about a 28% rate. We can talk about the implications of that, but that's where I think we're going to wind up centering out on income and capital gains.
And right before we started, I saw a little blurb on the SALT tax deduction.
Yes.
That's being, I guess, any discussion of that's being removed. The only 2 people who seem to be in favor of the SALT tax deduction are Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, obviously in the very highest of high state taxes in New York and California. And of course, New York is going through its own big tax increase as well. Is a SALT deduction being put back in place dead on arrival, in your opinion?
I am really out of consensus on this, but I believe that SALT will be reinstated, and it will be reinstated fairly aggressively as part of any bill that Biden passes. Let me first say why I think people are bearish about the SALT deduction coming back. First, it's very expensive. It costs about $90 billion for 1 year to fully reinstate the SALT. If I raise the top marginal tax rate on the wealthy, I generate about $115 billion over 10 years. Okay, so that's just the magnitude of the change that's happening there. That's number one. Number two is that a majority of House Democrats oppose reinstating the SALT deduction because the value of that deduction goes up the more money you make. I often argue that Trump raised taxes on my billionaire clients and cut taxes for my millionaire clients. Okay. And that's because the SALT went away and the SALT was more valuable for my most wealthiest clients. And so what's happening here is that progressives in the House are adamant about arguing no SALT change. So if you know all that, why would I be so aggressively bullish on the idea that SALT's going to get put into place? Number one is, you hit it, is that Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House. She's from California. California just lost its first House seat based on the 2020 census. For the first time since California has become a state, have they lost a congressional seat. Do you? And by the way, they've always had domestic migration in and out of that state, but they've always had immigration to replace that domestic migration. They're losing a seat because the domestic migration is so much larger now than the immigration coming back in. It probably is the greatest wealth migration that we're seeing in our lifetime, the movement away from high tax to low tax states. And so Pelosi knows that 10% of California taxpayers pay 90% of the state income tax. You do not want to kill the golden goose. And she is forcefully saying that she wants to get that SALT reinstated. On the other side, the Senate is run by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer from New York. And look at what New York did just 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
They have decided, despite having $20 billion sent from the federal government, despite their tax revenues today being higher than it was pre-COVID, that they wanted to raise taxes on income, capital gains, dividends, estates, and corporations. Does that sound familiar? It's like
Yes,
the
it
Biden
does.
plan at the state level.
Mhm.
And what state officials are saying is they can get away with this now because SALT is going to be reinstated. By the way, it's not 100% guaranteed. Why wouldn't you just wait for SALT to get reinstated and then do it? You don't need the money,
Right.
okay?
Right.
But they're literally putting so much pressure on Schumer that he's got to come out with something on SALT, or that migration will really start to move out.
Amazing.
Now, that's all interesting, but this is about where are the votes. I am a big believer that legislative strategy is like Field of Dreams. Build it and they will come. And what Speaker Pelosi is doing is she's building a bill. You're going to ask 20 House Democrats from some of the wealthiest congressional districts in America. By the way, cool factoid, 65% of people who make over $500,000 a year are represented by Democrats in Congress. Okay. You're now going to ask those Democrats to vote on higher income, higher capital gains, higher dividend, and higher estate. You better be giving them a SALT work off, or they'll never be able to vote for the bill.
Yeah.
So the progressives can go and they can do big press conferences at the Capitol and say, we're not voting for a bill that has a SALT deduction. That means they're willing to give up universal
All the things they wanted. Yeah.
community college. They're never going to give up all that stuff just because the state and local tax deduction comes into effect. And Pelosi's probably going to have to buy them off with something like student loan forgiveness or something like that. But I'm telling you, when we get deeper into this bill, SALT's going to be part of the solution. And if it isn't, it's very hard to see how all these other tax increases are going to be able to go through, which means the Democrats really aren't going to have a bill. And so that's why I have a bit of an added consensus view. There are no guarantees in this business. There's a lot of uncertainty. It's probably the most uncertain political bill that I've seen in 25 years in politics. But I'm just using my experience and matching that up. And I think there's going to be some SALT workaround.
And certainly the market has been reacting to a variety of different events. Last week is a good example. The market reacted very negatively to a Bloomberg story on Biden looking to increase capital gains taxes. And of course, candidate Biden campaigned on higher capital gains taxes. Right. So why was the market surprised? And does it raise, and we talked a little bit about where that inflection point is on raising revenue. This probably is something that's almost not worthwhile arguing over because it doesn't raise enough revenue. But does it do something socially? Is there something about it that goes beyond perhaps dollars and cents? Is it sending a message or a redistribution message in some way? Absolutely.
So I think there's two parts to your question. The first is I have a full archive on my Strategas website of everything I've written. We've always incorporated a 43.4% capital gains and dividend rate as the Biden proposal. And a lot of my clients raised money for Joe Biden. They're very influential people on Wall Street. And they would say to me in October, this tax plan is so bad, it makes me almost want to vote for Trump. And it was like, like a running joke that we would all have. And they would say that. And it was like, but Biden's really never going to propose this. And then it came across the screen last week and people were like, whoa, this is really happening. And so I just think that, because the experience of 40 years ago is so negative about what we did on capital gains, that there was a belief that this was not real, that this was just to win a primary against Bernie Sanders. And so what was that experience? In 1968, the capital gains rate was 25%. Over the course of the next 8 years, we went all the way up to an effective rate of almost 49%. Okay, so we basically doubled it. The returns on the S&P 500 during that time were very poor. It's actually a negative real return on the S&P. And there were a lot of different factors that were going on during that time, higher inflation. But we were strangling capital. We were strangling new investment. In 1978, Jimmy Carter was forced to lower the capital gains tax from that 49% rate and put it at 28 and basically kept it there. We've been below 30% for 40 years because people sit around the fire, around the campfire and say, oh, we don't go over that because we'll dry up all of our productivity. Maybe we got to make these mistakes every 50 years or so just to remember them. I don't know. But I think people were caught off guard that the moderate Joe Biden was going out and doing something. We all know it doesn't raise revenue. Like the Joint Committee on Taxation, which is not a right-wing organization, it's the official revenue scorekeeper for Congress, has told Joe Biden this is going to lose $50 billion over 10 years if you put the tax rate here. And that's what's starting to lead people to believe that maybe this isn't about raising revenue on some of these tax increases. Maybe it's about closing income inequality and trying to kind of equalize wealth because of the widening wealth gap. And we tried this in the late 60s, early 70s, and it failed. And the reason why it failed is because we weren't making everybody better off. We were trying to make somebody worse off to make somebody else better off. And that never really works in history. The wealth has already been created. You want to be able to then take that and make the new investment from it. What Biden's saying is we're going to take that wealth that was created and we're going to redistribute it out. And it's going to create growth. It's just transferring and it's inefficient and creates deadweight loss. At least that's what we learned. By the way, I'm pre-COVID, I wasn't really worried about income inequality. I thought it was a political issue, not really an economic issue. COVID has exacerbated income inequality. People who could stay home and work and could take care of their kids did. And the people who couldn't stay home and also had their kids not being able to go to school were the ones who can least afford it. So we do have to address it. It's just that this probably isn't going to be the right path. And that's the bet that Biden's making. It's an incredible bet that he's making, is that America wants to see this happen. And I'm not really sure we're there yet. I don't think Congress is there yet. And that's why I think the capital gains rate will end up around 28%. And we will stay below that 30%, marker that's been there since 1978.
Yeah. And then, many of our clients are very charitable. What happens to charitable giving, and then also not just on charitable giving, but also on capital gains? Will they make it retroactive to the beginning of the year? Because obviously, wealthy people can afford to do things, and we'll call it. I'm sure the administration would call it gaming the system. Someone else might just say good tax planning. But could they change these things going back to the beginning of this year in an effort to raise as much revenue as possible?
So there's two questions there. Let's take the first one on charitable giving. And I'm going to wrap up the estate tax into the charitable giving because I think it's very much linked.
Yep.
What I'm about to tell you is not designed to scare anybody on this call, but if you read the Biden plan, his estate tax plan is a two-part plan. The first is that right now, if you transfer an asset to your heir, you are doing it, and when your heir gets it, the basis steps up, we call it. It resets. And so, the IBM stock you transfer to your kid after death, is no longer the 1971 basis, is now the 2021 basis. Biden gets rid of that system and moves to what's called the carryover basis. Is that when that asset transfers to the heir, you'll be carrying over the basis. Okay. Now you will pay on that original basis when you pay the tax. What I think was most misunderstood today when the Biden plan came out is that Biden is actually moving to an unrealized capital gain on the transfer of the asset to the heir. He basically says once the heir takes that asset, not only do they have to pay on the carryover, but then they have to pay the tax immediately. And so what the goal of that is that you have to then sell the asset to pay the tax, and it breaks up inherited wealth. The Biden administration were adamant today that if you're transferring a business that needs to be run, there will be exceptions for that. By the way, I don't think this has a chance of passing Congress. Yeah. But how this links to charitable giving is that if you give a gift to your kid or you give a gift, then that basis is already carrying over, and they're trying to equalize it out like that. And my sense is that what Biden's trying to do is have people give to charity and give to other types of organizations. I can tell you my life insurance clients are excited about this because people are going to buy more tax advantage products. And Warren Buffett, he's going to be able to find a lot of small businesses that he could buy as people are looking to sell their business to pay the tax. But my sense is that that's not going to go through. But they were very coy about it in their description, where they said, "Oh, we're going to make it so that the tax is recognized as a taxable, the transfers are recognized as a taxable event." And it was like buried at the end, and I was like, "Whoa, that's an unrealized capital gain." And I think it's going to get a lot of attention in the estate planning circles. Now, just to give you context, Joe Manchin, who's the senator from West Virginia, Kristen Sinema, the senator from Arizona, they both voted to repeal the estate tax previously, to just get rid of it completely. They are going to be much more forceful in evaluating Biden's plan. But ultimately, if you're raising taxes on the wealthy, you're likely going to see more charitable giving, all else being equal. Now, I say that, but I do believe that the greatest move to charitable giving is creating wealth, because Americans are extraordinarily generous. And I actually think if you didn't raise taxes, you actually have more aggregate money going into charitable giving. Here it's a relative. You're going to raise taxes. Well, I'm going to give money less to my kids and more money to charity, or give money less to something else, because you're trying to minimize your tax burden from that.
Yeah. And one thing that comes to mind is people with large real estate portfolios where they may have a negative basis in their real estate holdings. And that becomes really problematic in an estate situation. You could potentially sell off the real estate and still have money under that kind of a proposal.
Dan, let me tell you a great story. In 1976, we made the carryover change. So we went from a step-up basis to a carryover basis. We did this already.
Yeah.
And 3 years later, it was such an administrative nightmare for issues like you're talking about on real estate that the Congress repealed what they had just done 3 years earlier, realizing that they made a giant mistake. There are 4 senators who voted to keep that system in place, just 4. One of them was the senator from Delaware, Joe Biden. So he believes this. He's going to fight for it. We take that very seriously. And that's on the estate tax. Now, you asked me about retroactivity. That is the question. I mean, that is what my clients are asking about all the time, right? About whether these taxes can go back, capital gains in particular. We have never had a capital gains tax increase ever in the history of retroactive capital gains in the history of the United States, okay? Which I think is very telling, because we did retroactive income tax increases in the same bill, but we never made capital gains retroactive. And my belief is that capital gains tax increase, if it gets enacted in any form, will be effective right around the day of the signing of the bill or the day the House and Senate passes the bill. We will not do it prospective, and we will not do it retroactive, most likely, given the consequences of both of those.
Yeah.
Okay? And they're big consequences. In the income, 1993, we passed a bill in August. We made it retroactive to January 1st.
I remember. So that could be on the table.
It could be on the table. 1968, we did the same thing. And, my sense is that, you could have retroactivity. Now, on the estate tax, I had to apologize to my clients on Friday, because Bernie Sanders had been saying that the estate tax changes were going to be retroactive. And most of the estate tax changes in history have been retroactive. But when you look at the Bernie Sanders proposal, it's actually prospective, starting on January 1st, 2022. So my sense is that there might be some constitutional issues on some of the issues that they want to resolve on the estate tax, trying to do it retroactive. And then on corporate, which we haven't even talked about corporate yet.
I was just going to switch over to that.
Corporate. I think if you get some tax increase on corporate, it would be prospective, meaning it would start on January 1st, 2022. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has been very forceful in her public comments about talking about the need for it to be future looking. The market's just not priced to chop off 40 or $50 billion of earnings this year. And I think the administration has been very good in guiding the idea that it could be on a forward-looking basis.
So Dan, that's a great place to move to, because obviously we follow publicly traded companies that pay taxes. And can you explain what's out there now? But perhaps start off with what you had told me about the Trump corporate tax cuts, because they actually went further than perhaps what the administration was even looking for to the downside. But this seems like going further in the other direction. And how does that also affect pass-through entities like LLCs, which many of our clients, own businesses and structure them through LLC type of structure?
So number one, the Trump tax cut, which passed in December of 2017, reduced the effective tax rate on U.S. corporations at the S&P 500 level by about 7 percentage points. It probably reduced small caps even more than it did large caps, because if you have more domestic income, you are more levered up to a lower tax rate. So the tax rate went from 35 to 21%. It's a 14% reduction in the rate, or 14 percentage point reduction in the rate. But there were a lot of deductions that got closed off as part of that. So you were able to have a lower rate, but you lost some deductions, and the net effect of it was about 7 percentage points. But what Trump did was that he moved to make the US international tax system more competitive. Nearly every country has what's called a territorial tax system. That means if you earn profit outside your home country, you can then bring those profits home tax-free. And the US just never had that. And Trump says, I'm going to do that because I want the money to come home. And boy, did they bring it home. They brought home $1.6 trillion over the last 3 years. And that money was used for employment, wages, mergers, share buybacks, dividends, paying down debt. And it's about a fourfold increase from the previous 3 years before the tax cut was enacted. What Biden is saying is Trump went too far on the corporate tax rate, and he wants to move to what's called a worldwide tax system. Again, what is Biden thinking? We're in a post-COVID world. World War II created an international system called Bretton Woods, where we basically redesigned the international finance system after World War II. Treasury Secretary Yellen believes that COVID-19 has created the catalyst for a renewed and updated global financial system. And what Biden is proposing is to tax worldwide profits of US companies. So let's just take Pfizer, for example. I'm not picking on a company, but Pfizer has a lot of its intellectual property in Ireland, and they earn a profit on that, and they pay taxes to Ireland at 12.5%. What Biden is proposing is that Pfizer would now have to pay the difference between the US rate and the Irish rate before they have any leftover profits. Now, there are 4 or 5 countries in the world who have this system, the largest being Mexico. I think Iraq has the second largest. And that's why you see Biden talking about a global minimum tax. And you're going to see him talk about it tonight, where he's saying, I want other countries to do the same thing that we're doing so that there's less tax competition across countries and that we don't hurt the US international competitiveness. The challenge for Biden here, because he reverses the entire Trump tax changes through this international tax system, a full 7 percentage point increase. The challenge is Biden's going to have to convince Democratic members of Congress that he is not handicapping international competitiveness of US companies if this change goes through, which means that Biden's going to have to show real, tangible, material progress at the OECD global tax negotiations before Democratic members of Congress feel really comfortable about doing this. By the way, I think the corporate rate can go up to 25%. I think there's going to be some changes on the international tax. I don't believe that Biden's going to get all this, because the OECD negotiations are actually going to be going in an opposite direction from where Biden wants to go. And I think that's going to be hard for him to justify to Democratic members of Congress of handicapping or
And
kneecapping.
how do you enforce something like that? And my other question is, when the U.S. lowered the rate during the Trump administration for corporations, how many countries followed us from that standpoint? And so now when you go back up again, you become much less competitive in those countries.
Yeah, the US had the highest corporate tax rate in the world in 1986. We lowered it as part of the 86 tax reform, and the whole world followed. And what that did was it lowered the cost of capital around the world, and that actually raised standard of living. It's probably one of the greatest periods of reduction in world poverty. The Berlin Wall coming down, the supply of labor increasing, and the cost of capital going down for firms. And when by the time we got to 2000, I don't know, 12, 13, we then had the highest corporate tax rate in the world again, because every country had now exceeded us. And so Trump brought us back in line with the national average. And as we did that, you started to see the dollar increase, and you started to see capital flowing into the United States over the last few years. If you look at US stocks relative to non-US stocks from the time the Trump tax cut went through, I think US stocks were up 60%, 60, 70%, and non-US stocks were up 25%, right? So massive outperformance of US over non-US. And I think countries realize they have to compete, and they started to follow. If you start going in the other direction, you may see other countries start going in the other direction, and that's going to increase the cost of capital globally. And the countries that are laughing the most at this are led by China, who think the West are going to like kill themselves by doing this. So you just need to be careful. None of this is fatal, okay? Right. But you got to be careful, because when you add it all up, higher income, higher capital gains, higher dividend, higher corporate, you end up with a tax increase that's about 3 times the size of what Bill Clinton or Barack Obama or George Herbert Walker Bush did. And that's outside what we normally do. We haven't done anything like that since 1968.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, we're in the midst of earnings season right now, and I've listened to about a dozen quarterly earnings calls so far, including Apple right before we started. I haven't heard one corporate executive talk about higher corporate tax rates, or any sell-side research analysts asking any questions about it as well. Do corporations know something that we don't know about the prospects for these taxes going up?
Dan, I would start off by saying that when I talk about this, and we're talking about it conceptually, we're not going to pass a tax bill anytime soon. It's going to be 1 or 2 quarters away. I'm the skunk at the party, because we're going through the best economic data of our lives. I think people just want to enjoy the next 3 months. Hey, I'm looking at some of these earnings of these companies. I mean, they're monstrous. Yeah. Right. And the analysts have just totally missed it, and the companies are blowing out their earnings. And Dan, things are so good that even if all that happened, it wouldn't be bad. Wait, I'm telling you, in a quarter or 2 from now, this will be the issue when there is a live bill moving. And the CFOs have already plugged in the numbers. I plugged in the numbers. It's material. So some of it is like, oh, it's not going to happen. Just like we talked about on capital gains. The market said, wake me up when we got to the Trump tax cuts. All year, they ignored it. And as soon as that bill dropped on October 31st, the market focused on that. When it becomes real, the market will know, and they will focus on it. So we're still 1 or 2 quarters away, but wait till that happens, because these international tax changes are so big. And when I talk to the companies, they're expressing their displeasure, and then they're getting on their earnings calls, and they're not even talking about it. And they're like, oh, if we're not asked, we're not even going to bring it up. And that's because it's early in the process.
Right.
But let's just talk about the EPS effect. We're scheduled to have a 14% increase in earnings next year. It's a great year. And if the Biden plan went through, which it won't, but if the Biden plan went through, you would subtract nearly all of that earnings growth away. Our compromise scenario means that we'll shave off about 6% off that growth, and earnings will grow at 8%. Again, a great year. 8% is a great year for earnings. It's just that we're just going to have to kind of eat the spinach, right, and kind of adjust down our expectations if some corporate tax rate bill is going to go through.
And of course, this all dovetails with the president's approval rating being very strong right now, because the focus, as you've said, is on reopening the economy
Exactly.
and the situation around the virus getting better. When does he get when does he get knocked down a little bit?
Dan,
From
I,
that?
I love politics. I love economics and markets as well, but I love politics. I've been doing this for a very long time. And over the course of the last year, all people wanted to do was talk to me about politics. They were home, they were quarantined, they were watching social media, and they were watching their TV, and they had basically nothing else to talk about.
Yep. Yep.
People are fatigued on politics.
Yeah.
And they're going back to their lives. And they're getting hobbies again because they're getting vaccinated. It's awesome. I tell the story. I went to go see my mother. She lives in a senior community. I felt like I was in the movie Cocoon from the 80s because all these vaccinated seniors were out having a great time. It was awesome. Okay. And so what's happening here, people are just looking at what's important now. What's important now? Hey, I'm getting vaccinated. I'm seeing my kids again. We probably just had Passover and Easter and didn't have guilt seeing our family members because we didn't feel like we were doing something illegal.
Right.
That to me is the most important factor. But you're asking the right question. Usually right around April 15th, presidents start losing their political capital in their first year. And it's very interesting. You get this honeymoon and then they start to turn. And, for Biden, he's well liked. He's very different than Obama or Trump or Bush or Clinton or even Reagan. And there's just an empathy with Joe Biden. So maybe this time is different.
Yeah.
But he's making a really risky bet here. And I think that the moderate Democrats are starting to get nervous. And the Republican voters are starting to say, this is the end of the republic. And that's usually what happens.
Yeah.
Voters voted for Joe Biden. And the world went back to normal in their mind. Now I can go watch baseball games.
Yeah.
And the conservatives are like, do you see what's going on at the border? Do you see my gasoline prices? My taxes are going up. $4 trillion budget deficit. They're intense. That's how this always works.
Yep.
So there's a 2/3 probability in the betting markets right now that the Republicans are going to take the House in November when this is all over.
Wow. So Dan, we're starting to get some questions from some clients here, and first question is on the salt tax. You think that if it's reinstated, will it be reinstated without limitations or with some limitations? Will that be part of the negotiation?
It's a great question. As I mentioned before, if we just went full reinstatement, it would cost $90 billion, which is actually a lot of money. We talk about trillions so much these days that maybe we're immune to it, but because Biden wants to pay for it, 90 billion is a large expenditure.
Yeah.
Let's just say we put a cap on income, and we say only people who make $400,000 or less can have it. It doesn't really solve Pelosi or Schumer's problem because you want to keep your billionaires there so that they continue to pay more state income taxes. They are very worried that if the largest taxpayers leave those states, then they're going to have to lay off public employees, which are very important to the Democratic coalition. And I'll just give you this example. There's a hedge fund manager named David Tepper in New Jersey. When he left for Florida, one person. Now he took his firm, which has highly paid employees, but when he left, the state of New Jersey had to revise its entire capital gains forecast with him leaving. Is that amazing? It shows you how broken the state tax systems are, but it was always able to be papered over as long as SALT was in place because you can deduct your SALT. Once SALT went away, the game was over. And people saw what it was. The arb spread became too great between California and Texas. So that's why I don't think there's going to be a limitation on income. There will likely be a limitation on the value of the deduction. Let's say the top tax rate is 39.6. When you take a deduction, your deduction is 39.6.
10.6, right.
My sense is that they're going to limit it to like 28% or something like that.
Okay.
And that, to me, is enough to keep most of the billionaires in those states, based on wanting to be in New York City or wherever they're going to be, or having to be around Hollywood to manage the Hollywood money, as many of my clients are being faced with.
Yep. We have another question on the estate tax and the exclusion amounts. Where does that negotiation go? Will there be limits on the exclusion amounts within the estate tax? Do you see as a compromise? There's a lot of people who think that the estate tax really does very, very little from revenue raising as well. And I'm just curious what your thoughts there.
Yeah, so first, let me just give you full disclosure. Before I joined Strategas 14 years ago, I authored 2 studies on the economic cost of the estate tax, the cost of compliance, the reduced loss savings that we get from that. So there's a lot of economic distortions, and you don't really generate a lot of revenue. By the way, the most wealthiest Americans will never pay any estate tax because they have an army of lawyers to figure out how to get around it. It winds up hitting the small business owner the most. And so I'm extraordinarily sensitive to the exemption amounts. If you ask me what I was surprised about, Biden had been guiding us that he was going to offer a 45% rate up from 40. And they were guiding that they were going to do a $3.5 to $5 million exemption. So if you're in Bergen County with a $3.5 million exemption, and you own a house and a car, a brokerage account, you're probably going to get hit with the estate tax under that plan. And Biden said, no rate, no exemption. I'm just going for the carryover base change and the unrealized capital gains tax. And I thought that was an interesting strategic move, because I can actually probably find more support for lifting the rate to 45 and maybe lowering the exemption level down from 11 to 9. But Congress is going to be really sensitive about that exemption amount, because once you move the exemption down, you're now triggering small businesses and farmers in there. And the last thing we want to do is kill small businesses.
Yep. Okay.
I know that you have some small business owners here. Biden makes another important change that didn't get a lot of attention today, but we have this 3.8% investment tax on capital gains and dividends from the Obamacare law.
Right.
He applies that now to small business income, not just investment income, because the belief was that we would take our capital gains and drive it through an LLC to avoid the 43.4% capital gains tax. And so they're plugging all these holes. But, look, if we walked out of this deal with a 45% estate tax rate and a $9 million exemption moving forward, I think that would be a huge win for the estate tax planning community, given what's actually on the table right now, which is a backdoor wealth tax, which I find to be worse than Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax.
We have a question on cryptocurrency, and I'm so happy that this has come up too.
Yep.
I've had numerous conversations with your esteemed partner Jason Trennert on cryptocurrency, and he always points out to me that gold is a 2,000-year-old brand and cryptocurrencies have a 10-year-old brand. So how are the Biden is there anything in the current proposals on cryptocurrency? You did have a little bit of a jitter in the market several days ago. I'm curious, the new SEC chairman, he doesn't seem to be, he's on record not being a huge fan. This seems like, there's a tax element to it, but it seems like with the wave of a wand of a central banker, they could almost legislate out cryptocurrencies in some regard.
And first, let me say, we were dealing with rumors that there would be an 80% tax on cryptocurrency all week. And but and by the way, like, nobody knows, so it could be. But here's the way I think about it: the U.S. is a reserve currency. The U.S. began to impose sanctions around the world on Iran and Russia and China. And we can do that. We have the power to do that, but you have to be judicious about how you're using those sanctions. And I'll give you one example of how this relates to cryptocurrency. When Obama won, Altria, which is a tobacco company, went to the Obama administration and said, you should regulate tobacco. You should have the FDA regulate tobacco products for the first time. And of course, the Democrats jumped on that and said, yes. Now, why would Altria want to do that? They want to create barriers to entry so that they can lock in their market share and they could ride that storm out for a decade. And it worked brilliantly for them. Within 6 months of the Obama presidency, we regulated FDA tobacco. There were no more lawsuits for the companies. All the other tobacco companies were forced to consolidate. And eventually, it caught up with them. That vaping was developed and began to take serious market share away from the tobacco companies. Then Altria had to buy Juul, and then Juul, which was that basically start getting regulated. That's a great example for what's going on in crypto right now, because as the U.S. ramped up sanctions, people were going to figure out a way to get around those sanctions, and cryptocurrency became one way to do that. Right. Yeah. So where is the biggest concern in the U.S. government over cryptocurrency? It's money laundering. Okay, and it's huge. The second is that it could become an alternative to the US dollar. When I talk to CEOs and I talk to them about the reserve currency being at risk over the next 30 years, they would say, there is no alternative. What are you going to do? You're going to give JJ Ping your money? Of course not. Okay, like of course you're not going to do that. But if you have an alternative like a crypto, that's all you really need, right? So now I got money laundering, sanctions, I got reserve currency at play, a lot of issues there. And I just want to give you this example. JJ Ping was in charge of the 2008 Beijing Olympics, which was the coming out global party for China. He was the guy in charge. He is personally overseeing the 2022 Winter Olympics in China. And they are going to introduce a digital Chinese currency for everybody to use and get people hooked on it. They're using this event to create an alternative to the US currency. So now, if you are a US government official and you're losing money on taxes and you got all of those stuff going on, why would you be like, we're going to regulate, we're totally going to regulate this currency, right? And so Yellen wants to do it. People inside the Biden administration want to do it. But Gensler is a pretty smart guy. Gensler taught a course at MIT that you could watch on YouTube about cryptocurrencies. That doesn't mean that he's favorable to it, but he's knowledgeable about it. Yep. And that means that there's going to be a robust debate within the administration about how to best do it. Something is probably going to happen on the regulatory side. And let me just give you this other key point on cryptocurrency, which I think is really critical as you start to think about what these potential outcomes could be. More and more US companies are now buying Bitcoin and making it part of their treasury operations. That to me is critical because now you're creating stakeholders. And now as you go to regulate, you're going to have to deal with MasterCard and Visa and Tesla and everybody else that's involved in this process. So the longer the US government waits, the more stakeholders are going to be there, the less biting those regulations are going to be, or at least transition. So it's a balancing act. But I wouldn't be surprised if the US offers its own digital currency as an alternative. One, you want to regulate, but two, you want to have an alternative. And I think that's where the US government is headed. I think that's where Jay Powell's headed. But he doesn't want to tip anybody off. That's where he's headed.
Yeah. Dan, one final question. We're coming up on an hour, and we really wanted to get everybody so they could be prepared to listen to the president talk. And I feel very confident that you've educated us all, so we'll have a much better understanding of what's being said. The last question. So your colleague Courtney Rosenberger has done a spectacular job doing all these different stock baskets on various companies that are helped and hurt through all these things. I guess the short question I have is, are there any winners? Are there any sectors that are actually going to win, including, areas around infrastructure? Are there going to be very many winners if the full force of a lot of these taxes goes through?
So Dan, there's always going to be winners. There will probably be more losers than winners. And that poses a challenge to the Biden administration because the losers generally lobby harder than the winners. But What Biden is proposing is $110 billion plus up for highway spending. We know exactly what companies they are. They are concrete aggregate. They are the
Martin Marietta Materials, companies like
materials,
that,
right?
aggregates companies, yeah.
Then we're going to do HVAC, and we're going to do schools and make sure they have better ventilation systems in the grid. Industrials, I love the industrials right now. They're just a beautiful sector. Almost every sub-industry is doing well because they're levered up to this Biden plan. I love water. It's only like 4 water companies. Biden is putting 110 billion into water and 110 billion into highways, and the water industry is much smaller than the highway industry. And then you have the EVs. There's $100 billion in this plan for people to go out and buy an electric vehicle with this refund, as long as you cash in your clunker gas guzzler car. Okay. And why this is important. The EVs aren't working. I think Tesla's down like 10% over the last month or so, but it's the materials that go into those EVs, which I think is the real play. If we're going to have all this new demand for electric vehicles, then are we going to have enough supplies to build those electric vehicles? That's the question that's starting to emerge amongst investors today. So those are winners in the Biden plan. And, we have baskets that are associated with that. On the tax side, if you're an international company or US multinational with a low tax rate, you're going to be targeted. And what's interesting is it's the most innovative companies in America that are going to get hit with that tax. Semiconductors, biotech, life science tools, Google, Facebook, the hardware companies. And I think once Washington figures that out, then that's why we're going to have to moderate that plan. We have a 2-year backup of semiconductors, chips, and we're competing with China. Are we really going to go whack the semiconductor industry? I think that seems unlikely. So, my sense here is that this is why the plans have to moderate, because the losers are not the industries we want to be losers. And you already see that Biden removed $500 billion of price controls on pharmaceutical companies from his plan. Congress is saying they're going to put it back in, but I think it's going to be hard once Biden took it back out. Why would we want, hey, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, great job. Now we're going to go put price controls on you, and we're going to go hit you with taxes. Just seems unlikely, given the nature of what they've done.
And you did a spectacular job as always. You're always a moderating voice. I think the takeaways here is it's up for negotiation. It's going to be the art of the deal, to steal a line from the previous president, in terms of what ultimately takes hold from a lot of these proposals. Thanks again for your time tonight. Your insights were great. And let's see what happens. Perhaps we'll have a chance to do this again in a few months and see where we are.
Great. And thank you for having me.
And thanks to everybody who listened tonight. And to all our clients, thank you for your business. And we do hope you found this information informative and useful, and any suggestions on how we can make it better in the future, please reach out to one of us. Have a good evening.
The information contained in this webcast reflects the views of Palisade Capital Management, LLC, as of the date of its original broadcast, and such views are subject to change without notice at any time. All information provided in this webcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice or recommendation to purchase or sell any specific security. While the information presented herein, including information obtained from third parties, is believed to be reliable, no warranty is made concerning the accuracy of such information. There can be no guarantee that any forecast discussed in this webcast will be realized. Consult your financial advisor before making any financial planning or investment decisions. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results.